All righty. Well, good morning, everybody here in New Mexico. Good afternoon to everybody that's, east of the Mississippi. And then Aaron, good midnight to you. Thank you for joining us at such a late hour for yourself and stuff. So we definitely appreciate you coming by. So today we have, for our Planetary Science Sample Seminar Series, we have Aaron Cavosie. He's a geologist, geochemist, and planetary scientist. He's a senior lecturer in Space Sciences and Technology Center at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia, where he conducts research and teaches classes. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin and an MS and BS here from the University of New Mexico. He has published 90 peer-reviewed scientific papers and served as principal advisor of PhD, MS, and BS thesis students. He has received funding from the U.S. National Science Foundation, NASA, Australian Research Council, and other agencies. Again, research interests include geochemistry, microstructure, and geochronology. These are applied to endogenic and exogenic processes, including the study of asteroid impact structures, shock metamorphism, impact glasses, meteorites, the oldest rocks on Earth, Moon, and Mars, and the origin of granite, and so much more. And so, Aaron, we are so excited that you can join us today, and please take it away.
Thanks, Quentin. That was a lengthy intro. I appreciate that. To everyone who's logged in or in Albuquerque, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for asking me to come join you. I hope this is good. If it is, I'll take the credit for it. And if it's no good at all, I'll just blame it on the 15 time zones that separate us. I'm actually a bit emotional. Many of you that know me know that I spent quite a few years in Albuquerque at UNM. It was home for a long time, and part of me still lives there. I thought I'd just start the talk with a few photos of happy places for me in New Mexico. The photos on the top are just the spectacular geology that's there that you might take for granted if you live there, but I miss it dearly. Being able to look up at the Sandias is special. The image here is so nice looking; it just looks delicious, like you want to eat it or something. I couldn't resist also chucking in a photo from the Frontier Restaurant. It's the best dive restaurant in town. It's just across from the campus for those that aren't in Albuquerque, and I've spent way too many nights there. Along the lines of food too, I very much miss chili season. The roaster here isn't nearly as interesting as the smells and aromas that come out of those roasters that really are heavenly. And actually, New Mexico got quite a bit cooler, of course, after I left it, because someone found an impact structure there. And if those living around there, if you haven't yet taken the opportunity to go visit the Santa Fe impact structure, it's really worth visiting. It's just outside Santa Fe, and there are spectacular shatter cones at that location. And so for seeing planetary geology in the field, it's absolutely world-class and wonderful. And so I'm not sure if my message has gotten through, but if it hasn't, here's kind of my opinion on New Mexico. Something along these lines. And for any students that are dialing in, undergraduates or graduate students, or if you're thinking about getting into the graduate department at UNM, I spent a few years there and enjoyed it, but I just have a message for you guys from a time capsule in the past. The guy on the right, I haven't seen him in quite a few years, maybe 25 years, but I'm told he had a good time while he was there. All right. Let's talk a little bit about water on early Mars. We had a study come out at the end of last year that I will get onto in just a little bit and talk about that in a fair bit of detail. But I want to point out that the study we did had quite a few co-authors on it, a big mob of people from Curtin. The lead author is Jack Gillespie, who was a postdoc at Curtin at the time. He's since moved on and is in Lausanne with a research position. So Jack's doing good stuff. And also Christine in Adelaide, not far from where we're at here. So I thought I'd just start with a little shock and awe. because not everyone spends their time thinking about water on Mars. But you might think otherwise if you just go through the literature. From last year alone, there are a lot of papers on this subject published. This is just a smattering of ones that were in arm's reach for me. Apologies if your paper or your favorite paper is not up there. This is certainly not all the papers from 2024 that focused on different aspects of water on Mars. One might say there's a tsunami of papers about this subject. I think there's just 2 points I want to make here. One is that there's tremendous interest in this subject broadly for lots of different angles and lots of different aspects. The evidence, if you buy into it, is overwhelming for quite a role of water in lots of different portions of the Martian history. And I think if anyone from NASA is listening in and you're involved with proposals to send astronauts to Mars, I think we need to add some extra gear on their spacecraft, because with all these reports of water on Mars, you might think they could have a hazard of drowning. Anyway, we're going to move on from that. Last year was also very good for studies of Martian meteorites. There's many more studies published than the ones I have here. I just found a few on my desktop that I thought I'd stick up there, including our study. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But many other studies on dating aqueous activity and other Martian meteorites, determining the ages of some of the oldest clasts found on Mars and meteorites, and a variety of other reviews and perspectives that are really good. So there's a lot of great meat on the bone out there for learning about Mars through rocks that fall on Earth. There's really only 3 ways to divine for water on Mars. That is from space, or if you're lucky enough to be a rover, from the ground, and everything else comes from meteorites. This is a famous meteorite here. I won't say the name of it. Some of you might know. We'll come back to that rock later. Before we go too far into this, we need to spend a minute thinking about the Martian time scale. For those not familiar with it, it's split into 4 periods. You can see they're color-coded on this simple version of it. The Amazonian makes up most of Martian time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Amazonian today, although we'll touch on it here and there. And instead, we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the earlier periods, because that's where the evidence, there's more overt evidence for the action of water on Mars. And so let's have a look at some of those. Just in a very simple way, characterize broadly what's known and what's been observed on some of these time periods in terms of what the terrains of these ages record. I think probably the first observations were Mariner back in the early 1970s that sent photos back of these amazing what are called outflow channels. You can look at the scale bar on the image on the right here. These are thought from today's viewpoint to represent large outbursts of water onto the surface. In this case, I think the thinking on this is that it does not represent sustained water on the surface. More, they have the characteristics of short duration, high volume events. They're large landforms. And so the thinking is that these may be releases of groundwater over short duration time periods. So fairly dramatic sculpting of the landscape, leaving a record of this process, but probably not standing water. If we move back, the Noachian period of Mars is probably the poster child of early water on Mars in terms of a time period. Also, observations from Mariner going forward. observed all sorts of landforms, in this case, valley networks, they're called, that are interpreted to represent more prolonged activity of water on the surface, stable water cutting across the landscape, because these valley networks are in many Noachian terrains. But also are hydrous minerals that have been mapped from orbiter. There are clay minerals characteristically found in Noachian terrains, but not younger age rocks. And so these two lines of evidence put up a very good case for stable surface water on Mars during the Noachian period. And there's quite a bit of data on this. If you want to probe further back in time before the Noachian to the earliest period, the pre-Noachian, you have to take a different approach, because knowing, certifying materials or understanding their age as being from this time period is only possible directly from meteorites. If we take a look at the terrestrial collection of Martian meteorites, at least that listed in the Met Bull towards the end of last year, there are just shy of 400. I don't know if that number has changed, possibly. But you can see, in this case, they're color-coded to the time scale. And so the ones listed in orange here are the vast majority of Martian meteorites, and they're igneous rocks. These are the classic SNC suite, and they're all formed from the Amazonian time period. I mentioned a study last year about dating aqueous alteration of another meteorite. That was a knocklite here. And so these have their own story. That's an aqueous alteration history that's fairly young, something on the order of 700 million years.
Hey.
To go back further in time, to my knowledge, there's no Hesperian meteorites, but there's a Noachian meteorite, the famous Allen Hills 84, ALH 84001. That's a rather different type of igneous rock. There's all of one of those, n equals 1. But to get to the pre-Noachian, you've got to look at a different type of meteorites, and these are breccias. The famous one that many people may have heard of is NWA 7034. And paired stones, I think the recent count, there's 18 paired stones with this, so they have different numbers, but they're believed to be from the same event. And it represents a not insignificant proportion of the terrestrial collection. Fortunately, that's good for us. There's a number of these to have a look at. Aria did this nice review, published this nice review last year, and colleagues. I just thought I'd put one of the graphics up from this review because it's nice. It has photos that characterize the petrography of the different types of Martian meteorites and map it onto the time scale that we were just talking about, which is represented down here. But the thing that I just wanted to point out that's illustrated nicely here is the SNCs, you can see, are grouped having formed over this region of the Amazonian. And then there's a big gap in time with no representation in the meteorite suite. Here's the Allen Hills rock, and here's the stuff that we'll be talking about, the earliest material. I suppose folks at UNM know this rock fairly well, but for those that aren't there, NWA 7034 is also sometimes referred to as Black Beauty. Hats off to Carl Agee for introducing this oh so interesting rock to the scientific community a little over a decade ago. It's a bizarre gift that keeps on giving the more people look at it. It's really a wildly interesting piece of Mars. If you want to look at pre-Noachian material, this is the only place that you'll find it, this stone and its pairs. Contemporary thinking refers to this as a regolith breccia. It's thought to be lithified surface material, and it's quite heterogeneous. There's lots of different lithic clasts and rocks and different minerals floating around in this rock, and so it's quite a witch's brew of interesting bits of Mars. For our purposes, it's interesting in that it has the oldest pieces of Mars known. It has a suite of zircons that range over a 50 million year time window. There are some younger ones as well, but these are sort of the focus for this discussion. And so you can access the earliest Martian history by studying this rock. By analogy, there's no pieces of Earth found of this age, so we can't probe the same time period on Earth as we can on Mars, which is kind of interesting. The age of this meteorite, I put a question mark there. I hope that doesn't upset too many people. It's really a question of when did this stone become lithified? And there's some different ideas about that. I'm not gonna, I don't really have a dog in that fight, so I'm not going to favor one age or the other. Some people think by 1.5 billion years or perhaps younger, younger processes had acted on this rock, and so it was probably coherent at that point in time. But at some point later on, it was ejected from Earth, ejected to Earth, probably between 5 and 10 million years ago. And it's been studied for, as I mentioned, about the last decade. If we just take a quick snapshot look at a review that was published a couple years ago on what has been learned from just a geochronology point of view. I'm not going to go through the review of the petrography of the stone. There's a lot to talk about, and I don't have that much time. But if we just take a quick look at all of the different geochronology bits of Martian history that are represented by different types of minerals and different types of materials that have been accessed with different types of geochronometers. It's a bewildering array that pretty much spans almost all of Martian history, which is pretty cool. I'm not going to talk about the younger Amazonian portion. I'm not going to dive into that any deeper. I want to instead turn the attention a little bit to the pre-Noachian components because that's the subject that we're after today. I mentioned a minute ago that there's a population of zircons that have been found in a number of studies from Black Beauty and other paired stones that span about a 50 million year time window. On a epsilon hafnium plot here, the zircons are, this population's represented with the grains here in the center. You can see their age range. And their compositions in this space suggest that earliest crust might have been andesitic or even possibly basaltic. And so the idea here is that we're able to access bits and fragments of this very early Martian crust that are not represented by elsewhere in the Mars meteorite suite that's on Earth anyway. A paper published just last year nicely showed that clasts and zircons from some of these clasts, in this case in NWA 7533, nicely fall on and define an isochron of about 4.44 billion years, again, in the middle of this time window. And I think there's lots of interesting things here, but one is that the significance of this is quite a lot of the clasts in this rock actually date to that time as well. So there's so many different types of clasts, lithologic clasts in the rock. It's clear that many of them are associated with this early history, despite the complex, prolonged history recorded in this meteorite that lasts nearly the entire age of Mars. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the zircon that we've focused on for the last couple of years. 2 years ago, we described a grain that represented the first shock zircon reported from Mars, and I'll distinguish that because other studies had been done that had looked for shock effects in zircons and concluded that there's some unusual microstructures, but the distinguishing feature with the one that we found is it has deformation twins in zircon. These are lamellar twins that you can see and document quite easily with electron backscatter diffraction. And on Earth, we know this microstructure quite well. Zircons from many terrestrial meteorite impact structures display these features, and they're typically found in rocks in the central uplifts of impact craters, but also in a few other environments as well. And they're not known outside of that setting. We don't find these in mantle rocks or anywhere else. This initial study was done by a former PhD student, Morgan Cox, and she took a look at about 65 grains from 7034 and two other stones, and only one of them had this particular microstructure. Now, the significance of that is that if you take a rock from a terrestrial impact structure, a shock granite, if you will, or something like that, and it has been subject to the conditions to form these shock twins in zircon, typically you'll find a high percentage of the zircons in the rock have that microstructure. That's not what we found here, and so that told us a little something about the origin of this grain and its relationship to the meteorite that I'll go into more in just a moment. So to date, it's an unusual grain. We did some geochronology on it by SIMS, and two spots that landed in nice open domains were concordant. Two other spots that landed on some cracks fell off the Concordia, but we're pretty close to the Concordia here generally. And it yielded a nice clean age of 4.45 billion years. In other words, this grain falls right in the middle of that early suite, and it preserves a history of shock deformation. And so that's what the initial finding was on this grain. Here's what it looks like. It's always good to look at your sample from a bigger point of view. Here's the matrix of 7034. In this case, the zircon's right in the center. This is a backscatter image. And it's not inside of a clast. It's just floating in the matrix. Here's a closer view of that grain. You can see these parallel lines are the shock features. We don't always get to see them in backscatter, but in this case you can. And so this is the context of it in the meteorite. It's not a large zircon, and it doesn't quite look like this anymore. We've abused it since then, but this is what it looks like. So there are some questions that came out of that we wrestled with in terms of where did this zircon originate, and when did it become shocked, and what's the relationship between that and the meteorite? We rationalized that we did not think the shock deformation of this grain occurred in the framework of the matrix of the meteorite. Other studies have been done by Axel Wittmann and others of looking at some of the shock aspects, the shock stages of plagioclase and pyroxenes in this meteorite, and they record a much lower shock intensity, between 5 and maybe 10 GPa. And we think that the twins in zircons, these deformation twins, their formation conditions closer to 20 GPa. There's only a little bit of experimental work, so there's some uncertainty there, but that's a good empirical call for the moment. And the absence of these features in any of the other grains in the rock led us to say, well, this probably happened before it got incorporated into the regolith and prior to lithification. So in the context of what we know about where you find these things in terrestrial settings, the central uplift of meteorite complex impact structures, occasionally they're found in objects in ejecta that's excavated from structures. Subsequent impacts could further transport a shock zircon to somewhere else. And of course on Mars there's aeolian and fluvial processes early on that could have transported these grains as well. And so the short answer is we don't really have a good handle at all about what part of Mars this zircon originated in, because it's in a complex rock and it could have easily been transported. The other thing we don't know, I'd like to share the dirty laundry with you direct, because there's things we do know and things we don't know. And so let's be upfront about that. When it was shocked is another really challenging question to nail down. And the reason that's a challenging question is because the shock microstructures, these deformation twins and zircons, don't reset any geochronometers that we've been able to detect. We've tried and not been successful at using this as a geochronometer. So we propose that it's more than likely happened in the early history between pre-Noachian and Noachian, and we had some reasons for that, mostly because that was a period of high impact bombardment. But I'm not going to dwell on that further for this because it's an answer that we don't know very well. Now, the Zircon remains a unicorn. It's kind of one of a kind in terms of the Martian suite. And so we thought we'd take a deeper look at it and see what else we might learn. And so this is where Jack got involved. One of the first things we did was to analyze it by time of flight SIMS. And this is a very sensitive technique for doing elemental mapping. You could think of it like EDS that's a lot more sensitive, a much smaller probe between 50 and 100 nanometers. And we're just ionizing ions just at the very, very near surface. And so here's a CL image, kind of a typical image for zircon. You can see growth zoning illuminated in CL. And then here is a band contrast image. This is from EBSD. And you can see the shock microstructures that are at a high angle to the growth zoning. But what we found was interesting distributions for elements that we didn't think would be there. Iron, aluminum, sodium, those are not typical elements that you find in zircon. So this was an unusual observation up front. Yttrium's pretty normal. And you can see from the yttrium map here, it's defining zones that correspond to the growth zoning by CL. But so is iron, and so is sodium, and so is aluminum. So these are not hot spots or along cracks or fractures. These are elements defining crystallographically controlled parts of the grain. Now, normally, elements like iron and aluminum, even calcium, if you find them in zircon, it's a good indicator that the zircon is metamixed or radiation damaged, whereby it has become an open system and fluids can percolate in and introduce these elements long after crystallization. And so oftentimes these elements are a flag of a damaged zircon. In just a moment, I'm going to present some evidence for why we don't think that's the case in this grain. And instead, we interpret these elements as having been incorporated during igneous growth. So the method that we use, TOF SIMS, I mentioned it's quite a sensitive technique. One might propose that maybe it's so sensitive you can find low-level zoning in any element you wish, but that's not the case, so certainly not with iron and zircon. We've been examining many other zircons from other environments to test some of these ideas. This is some data from Jack that he, on a study he's doing. This is a zircon from a granite in Southeast Australia. And you can see it has very typical CL zoning here that's well behaved. That corresponds to variations in yttrium and to a lesser extent uranium. But we don't see anything going on with iron or calcium or any of these other elements. So you don't normally find iron zoning in zircon. It's not a typical thing. In fact, it's a really, really unusual thing to find in zircon. And so the question is, from the terrestrial record, where do we know this occurs? And one of the answers we found was pretty interesting. We're going to swing our attention now away from Mars for just a moment to a place that looks like it actually could be the surface of Mars. This is the Olympic Dam. It's a mine in South Australia that is endowed in iron ore, gold, copper, uranium, and I'm not sure what else. It's a large deposit. And the significance of Olympic Dam in this case is that it's a Proterozoic magmatic complex full of granites that experienced hydrothermal processes. These are magmatic hydrothermal granites, and the hydrothermalism associated with magmatism is in part what led to the ore deposits that are being checked out. Our colleague Christine in South Australia and her colleagues published a paper on zircons from Olympic Dam not long ago. And what they found is in the ore-bearing zircons, the ones from the most pronounced hydrothermal granites, the zones in the zircons by TEM observation had very well-defined zonations in trace elements like iron and others. So again, it's these non-formula trace elements showing up in zircon, in this case from a well-known environment where hydrothermal processes were integral to the formation of this deposit. Here's another zircon, again by TEM. You can see very intricate zonation in iron that follows the growth zoning, as well as calcium and even some subtle zonation in chlorine. And so the interpretation was that these zircons were crystallizing in a magmatic system that was also being flushed with fluids. And so these zircons were effectively being metasomatized at the same time they were being crystallized. You could think of variations of your water activity and your silica activity in these cooling magmatic systems, delivering the trace elements to these crystallizing zircons. And so this is a really interesting idea. Is it the case that hydrothermal zircons from these magmatic systems that produce these kinds of unusual trace element signatures in zircons from Earth, is that what we're seeing on Mars? We have iron zoning from our Martian zircon, and it's really intriguing to think that, well, we're aware of opaline deposits and other aspects of hot springs on the Martian surface. What's the source of this hot water? Something from underground, and perhaps it's similar style magmatism. At this site here at Gusev, these are a little bit younger deposits, although I'm not sure how well the age constraints are on this, but I think these are Noachian if I understand their current age. Anyway, so this is what we were thinking, but we wanted to dig deeper into this zircon to test the veracity of what the data says. So we took this zircon and did some sort of micro to nanoscale analysis. In this case, this is a TEM data where we cut some TEM foils to take a look and found all kinds of interesting observations here, and these are in the paper. The first observation is we didn't find evidence of radiation damage. Even with high resolution TEM, we found no evidence of amorphous domains or anything that was indicative of radiation damage. In other words, this zircon is very crystalline. That's consistent with the SIMS data from the prior study that showed that the uranium lead system is concordant, and also from SIMS, it has very low actinide content, which is probably why it has been able to stay crystalline over this time period. We're able to do some STEM EDS on the TEM and to work out that in foils like this, you find up to a couple atomic weight percent iron. Now, we also found other things. I'll just for reference put out the reference. Here's the deformation twins in the zircon. But all these lit up red items are magnetite inclusions. There's quite a few of them in this grain, actually. When you took a look at the magnetite inclusions more closely, we found some interesting behavior. Grains that were spatially associated close to twins, adjacent to twins, were deformed. You could see the lattices were bent in these small inclusions. They're only 10 or 15 nanometers, but we can see that. Whereas other magnetite inclusions further away from the twins didn't show this deformation. And so there's a spatial connection there of damaged inclusions. The other thing is a really key observation down here on the lower left. One of the shock twins in zircons is truncated by a magnetite inclusion. So it looks like as this twin tried to propagate through the zircon, it hit something that definitively is not zircon and stopped. And so that gave us a really interesting textural cross-cutting relationship here that the twins appear to have predated the shock event that produced the magnetite inclusions predate the shock that made the twins. So it's a very challenging scenario to come up with a way to try to get the magnetite inclusions inside the zircon after it's crystallized if they're not a primary feature. The zircon's crystalline zircon and it's not radiation damaged. So the easiest take on this is that these magnetite inclusions are primary features, something that formed in the zircon while it crystallized. Some of you may have heard previous studies on Earth about magnetite inclusions in zircon. Rich Taylor published an interesting paper 2 years ago that was a study of Jack Hill zircons. In this case, they had a very different goal. They were trying to understand what's the source of the magnetic signature in some of these very old zircons from the Jack Hills. And at TEM scale, they found magnetite inclusions in the zircon, but they were associated with radiation damaged areas. And so they concluded that in that case, those inclusions were not primary features at all, and they had good textural evidence for it, I think. That's not what we've got going on here. This zircon is highly crystalline, and so it's very difficult to shove inclusions inside a grain that's crystalline after the fact. So we think we have some important chronology features here that are constrained by some of these observations by TEM. We decided also to have a look at this grain in a little more detail with the atom probe. For those that aren't familiar with the atom probe, I don't have time to go into a detailed explanation, but I'll show a few pretty pictures. You prepare a sample. This is a polished surface of a zircon. These are backscatter images. And you prepare a lift out just as you would with a focused ion beam to produce a TEM foil. You put a little nugget where the feature is on the surface that you wish to examine and produce a needle from. And then you transfer that lift out over and mount it on a different post, and one at a time slice down the length of it to make cylinders, and then these cylinders are focused, sharpened rather, down to a tip that's on the order of about 50 nanometers, and that's what gets loaded in the atom probe. The atom probe pulses a laser at that tip, and also where field evaporation occurs. It's a time of flight instrument, so you can get mass and charge and identify what those atoms are, those ions are. And the detector on the atom probe is the special part of it. It can recreate and detect the position on the needle tip from where that atom originated from. It's a pretty remarkable instrument, but because you can recreate the position, you can do tomography. So atom probe data are often presented in needle shapes like this. So these are 3 elemental maps of one needle. We analyzed many. And all of the dots here are atoms that were collected of that particular element. And you can see there's a heterogeneous distribution here, and that's what's interesting. We can see a couple things here that I'll point out. We captured one of the shock twin boundaries here. This is one of the twins, and you can see it's elevated in all 3 of these elements, including iron. There's a magnetite inclusion down here at the base of this needle. I should note the scale bar too. This is a 50 nanometer scale bar. But then all of these other clusters here that we see primarily in iron, these aren't magnetite inclusions, these are iron clusters. And so clustering of elements and observable in atom probe is often driven by thermal processes, in zircon anyway, where it drives the mobility of elements to concentrate typically in dislocations and other defects in the zircon. And that's what we're seeing here with the iron. Again, we can get concentration data up to a few atom percent, and it doesn't actually correlate with other elements being incorporated at the time of growth, such as yttrium. And so we have just a bewildering amount of places and manifestations of where iron is in this grain. It's a very iron-rich grain between the clusters, lining twin boundaries, the inclusions of magnetite, and then the broad scale zoning. And so we have a very unusual zircon with an interesting composition. Putting this all together, we think this zircon formed as part of the early crust in that early crust forming event. We think these magmas were hydrous. Maybe they were andesitic. We don't know. That's what the hafnium data suggest. Magnetite inclusions formed as a primary feature at that time. At some later stage, probably early, ongoing bombardment shocked the zircon. It made the microstructure that we see. The formation of that microstructure modified some of these magnetite inclusions, providing some cross-cutting relations, and also produced the iron clusters we observed by atom probe. And then later, this grain was incorporated into regolith at some point and then blasted off to Earth. So we think that's the short story of that best explains some of the data that we're seeing. In the last couple minutes here, I just want to touch on a couple other studies that have addressed this issue of water on pre-Noachian Mars. And one was by a colleague here at Curtin, Sasha Nemchin. They took a look at oxygen isotopes in some zircons from 7533, 4 grains actually, including some very old ones. And what they found by oxygen was that these zircons fell off the prediction for being on the Mars fractionation line for oxygen. And it's an interesting data set because they fell off in different ways and to different magnitudes. Some of the younger zircons are a little bit different than the older ones and how they were affected. But it's fundamentally an observation that they're not in equilibrium with the mantle as predicted from the magmas that they formed in. And this was explained by the likelihood that they assimilated some regolith or crustal material that had interacted with hydrosphere, and that brought these materials off the fractionation line. There's another interesting study going back a little bit further by Borg and Drake. I don't know if Lars is still on board here. But it was a suggestion that the iodine and xenon isotopes might provide evidence of aqueous alteration very early. The way this works is the 129 xenon to 132 xenon between the atmosphere of Mars and the mantle, as measured in meteorites, is quite different. It's fractionated, whereas on Earth it is not. 129 comes from an extinct iodine isotope, and so you're changing these ratios. You're looking at processes that happen very early within the first 100 million years. And they propose 2 options, a fractionation of iodine relative to xenon in a magma ocean based on a higher solubility of iodine. But the description of their preference was for aqueous alteration because of the efficiency. Iodine is on the order of many orders of magnitude more soluble in water relative to xenon. And there's kind of a multi-step process here where the mantle outgasses, the iodine goes into the water, xenon goes to the atmosphere. That iodine 29, early iodine 29, gets saturated in the ocean crust. Later on, the early atmosphere gets stripped away, and then slowly the iodine enhanced oceanic crust drips out the xenon 129 to the atmosphere to explain the observation. The punchline here is that for this to work, there had to be water, and they proposed potentially a surface water or an ocean very early at about 4.5 billion years, which is really interesting because that's kind of what we'd like to say based on the zircon trace element data. The last study I'll note is the famous ALH 84001 with carbonates. A lot of people have worked on this stone, of course. Its age is, I think, accepted at about 4.1 billion. The carbonates are 3.9 billion years old, a little bit younger. But the interesting thing is the rubidium-strontium ratios and systematics of those carbonates aren't in equilibrium with the mantle at 4.1 billion years. And the suggestion here, I think this was made by Borg and his colleague, was that the easiest way to do this is if these carbonates sourced that strontium from some crustal material that was aqueous altered, altered by aqueous processes prior to the formation of the rock, a little bit older, in other words, so pre-Noachian time period. So all of these little bits and bobs of inorganic mineral analysis that or gas analysis that all sort of have a watery suggestion of watery origins on pre-Noachian Mars. Now, I'll just end with, for those that don't think about Earth's early water, I spent a fair bit of time looking at that in younger days. And this is a game primarily of looking at oxygen isotopes and zircons. You try to filter them for the early work we did, tried to look at the best zircons we could with those methods at the time. Later studies have looked at even more sophisticated methods to try to make sure your grain is not altered. But the data sets agree remarkably well and support an origin for water that's above the mantle values in here and over here by about 4.3 billion years. And so water on Earth is fairly accepted to have been a very early stable material. And so I don't think it's a problem to make that claim on Mars as well. So that's the case for a wet pre-Noachian Mars. We have the zircon trace element data that we just described. There's earlier oxygen data in zircons from fractionation associated with a hydrosphere. The xenon isotope data is wildly interesting to explain the difference between the mantle and Mars, perhaps as a consequence of an early ocean. And then the carbonates suggest some alteration process that's early. So these are the data. You can decide for yourself what you think, but I think they're intriguing, and this is a problem that should continue to be investigated. That's all I got for you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and we'll go ahead and open the floor up for questions for those that have any. We have a question in the chat. So it's first off, great study, Aaron. Really impressive TEM data. Sorry, there. Do you have plans to collect oxygen data on your zircons of interest?
That is a great question, and we've talked about that in great detail. The trouble is this lovely unicorn that we have is not in good condition. We've made lots of extractions from this small grain for the micro and nanoscale work that we've done. And the largest remaining area on it might be 5 microns. And so we kind of have a surface area problem. Making oxygen analyses, oxygen isotope analyses by SIMS is a very surface sensitive method. And so we're a little hesitant to try to produce a number where the nature of the surface of the sample might influence the number that we get. So we're thinking about it, but we don't have much material to work with at this stage.
Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, please. Sorry. Very interesting talk. Thanks a lot. It was really, really excellent. I just was curious about why you refer in your last slide and then somewhere embedded in your discussion, the presence of an ocean. Why is that required by the data as opposed to basically just groundwater system or something like that?
That's a great question. Thanks, Jim. We in our study, we didn't use terminologies like ocean. We were a little bit more circumspect because we, in terms of the trace element data, we don't know the size and scope of the hydrothermal system that we're dealing with, whether it's localized or whether it's a more of a general condition. We don't have enough data to know that. The discussions of oceans were repeating what others have said. Okay. I think Borg and Drake were proposing an ocean for to try to deal with the xenon isotopes, but I don't think our data allows us to say ocean because we just don't know the scale.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I'm just finishing up a paper on oceans on Mars, and it's not looking good. Okay, basically, but anyway, I'll send that along to you when I get it done. Thanks.
That'd be great. Thanks for that.
Carl, what's up?
Hi, so can you hear me? I'm in the back of the room.
I can hear you, Carl.
Great, I really enjoyed your talk, good stuff. I also enjoyed your paper. You know, we delved into where all of the water is located in Black Beauty. This is a study by Mutik et al. And I'm sure there have been some other studies later on after that. But, you know, we were really impressed by the fact that majority of the water is actually resides in magnemite. You know, this is sort of the hydrous version of hematite. And, you know, initially everybody, you know, when you think about Mars and the remote sensing, everybody's always focusing on phyllosilicates, you know, and we did find some phyllosilicates, but they were extremely fine-grained. They were down at very hard to spot. But again, I guess my take on it was the overwhelming source of water in Black Beauty is in iron oxides. And I'm wondering if this fits in with, in some way with the hydrothermal proposal or the groundwater proposal versus how you would form phyllosilicate on Mars. Anyway, just a remark there.
Well, no, thank you for that. That's a really interesting observation to go back to. Where do you find the other water that's not in phyllosilicates? There's a question of timing that's kind of hard to nail down with minerals like that. I hope I was able to present a logic argument that we think the magnetite inclusions that we found have to be a primary feature in the zircon. The truth is we don't know how to get them into the zircon otherwise. It would be easier if the zircon was metamicked and radiation damaged, but if that were the case, we wouldn't have published a paper that we did. So a lot hinges on the fact that this zircon is remarkably intact, and because isotopically, and because of that, we think we have a handle that at least the magnetite was an early material in that zircon at the time of formation. I think that means it's an iron-rich system. There's a lot of mobility of iron. And so when you find other materials in the meteorite, the question is, what's the age of the oxides that are carriers of the water at this point in time that we're measuring today? And that's a really challenging thing once you take the oxide outside of something that you have a good sense may have been a good time capsule over time. And so I don't know how to address that, but I think that's a really good observation that you made.
Chip?
Aaron, this is Chip. First, I just wanted to thank you for volunteering to do this. This is really great. And I really appreciate you waking up so early to give this talk. The question I had, you know, you kind of emphasized differences between this single zircon and other zircons and these lithologies in Black Beauty. Are there similarities between this and the other zircons that allow you to distinguish potential early crustal lithologies that are sampled by this rock type?
That's a great question, Chip. We don't know what lithology the zircon's associated with. It's frustrating. It would be really, really nice if it had been in a clast, because we could then associate a zircon with this microstructure with a lithologic type. I'm encouraged that it falls right in the middle of the age range of zircons that are the old population that have been reported by others. And so there's a guilt by association of age that it might be related to the other kinds of lithologies that we do see zircons in. These are a little bit more basaltic. I don't know if that's its host or not. There have only been EBSD studies of probably, I don't know, maybe a few hundred zircons thus far. And so it would really be nice if we had EBSD work on in situ zircons that are inside clasts, but now we're really reducing the number of observations that we can make down to the small number of zircons in class that we hope to expose at the polished surface. And so it's a slow person's game, but I think it's a game worth playing to sort of see, do we see evidence of a shock history in zircons that are in some of these clasts, because that would be a new piece of information that we don't know yet thus far. It's also entirely possible that this tetraidal zircon came from an entirely different class that we're unaware of and that we haven't seen. How likely is that? Well, I don't know. My guess is it's probably from some of the rocks that are in Black Beauty, but it doesn't have to be. So I'm not sure how further than age, how else we're going to make that connection between this shocked grain and what we see in the classed population. You need a smarter person than me, I think.
Thanks, Aaron.
Jim, you have a question?
Yeah, I had another question. So just in reference to the phyllosilicates, some of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years suggests that they're not actually, they predate the late Noachian Valley networks, and Ashley Palumbo and myself had a paper a couple of years ago in Meteoritics and Planetary Sciences where we talked about what happens when a major impact basin occurs. Okay, these are the scale of Argyre and Hellas, et cetera. And what happens based on, she did a detailed climate model for this, and it turns out that any water in the ejecta is basically vaporized, and you actually get a global rainfall that lasts very hot rainfall that lasts for maybe 100 years or so. And then that soaks into the regolith. It's hot. It's just what you need for phyllosilicate formation. And then of course, eventually returns to the ambient conditions. But these peaks are really great opportunities to get, almost everything you need, okay? Like a little bit of soaking down into either ejected zircons or those just in situ, and actually having infiltrating hot rains, hot water in there too. So that's Palumbo and Head. It's maps, I think 2000, I don't know, a couple years ago. But anyway, that's just another thought to put into the context of where water was, where high temperature alterations might have occurred and produced, I don't know what we would say here, but just not necessarily strange bedfellows, so to speak, but things that look that you don't usually see that are very interesting. Okay.
What was your proposal, Jim, that the phyllosilicates resulted from this process rather than standing water?
I think that's the best option, because basically when you look at the ages, they predate the valley networks, which is arguably, evidence, those open and closed basin lakes. We would have all the phyllosilicates that are related to that being transported from this earlier phase of phyllosilicate formation rather than produced in situ and standing bodies of water. The evidence for the Noachian Ocean is pretty grim, pretty non-supportive, if you will. And so, no pun intended, but the options for surface alteration of phyllosilicates is evaporating, okay, down to a residue of maybe a couple of large events, I think. It's something to think about. It's another model, but it may offer not only an explanation for those phyllosilicates, but also for some of the alteration products that you might see put together in Black Beauty, et cetera. And this is, of course, the time that those would happen, those impact basins, pre-Noachian, early Noachian.
Well, if contemporary thinking is starting to frown on oceans, that's good to hear. Our data don't really give us a sense of volume, so it's good to hear from other sources.
I'll send you the reference as soon as I get back to it and find it here. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jim. Aaron, we are out of time, so thank you so much again for giving this talk.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate the invitation, and I think I have a bed calling my name.
Yes, please get the much needed rest that you need. Next week we will have Chip Shear giving a talk about some of the pyroclastic stuff that we have found on the moon. So please tune in for that. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your week. Enjoy your upcoming weekend, and thank you so much for joining us at the Planetary Sample Science Seminar Series.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.